There's so many implications and some very high order implications. I think the same way that we had to grapple with the Facebooks and the Googles of the world had to get how they deal with personal data right. And in many ways, a lot of the tech companies have actually gotten that question wrong about our personal data. In many ways, building data is a much more emerging sector where we actually don't know what to do with it. A simple example of this is that there's so many stakeholders around a building that the question of ownership and who should have access and what kind of permissions is actually a really difficult question to solve for. An example of this is while there may be a building owner, and within that building there may be several floors, in which case you might have multiple different tenants, and then within each tenant floor you might have individuals. There's a host of questions about personal privacy, tenant privacy, building owner privacy, and sometimes it's not as clear cut. If a tenant, for example, requests our service, we'll digitize a space on behalf of the tenant, but when you kind of consider the overall shell of the building, that shell kind of belongs to an owner, right? So there's all these intertwining stakeholders, right, that make up the built environment. That makes it a little bit more of calculus than just say personal data. And getting that right is particularly important. I'd like to think that we're kind of on the forefront of this, and I think maybe just making sure that morally we're taking a few stances on building data. For one, I'm a big believer that if you own the physical asset, you should likely own the digital version of that asset as well. That's not the case today. And so while the digitization of buildings evolve, will likely be pushed in a variety of different ways, from, tenants in buildings requesting accurate plans of their space so they can renovate it. But what I imagine is that at a certain point, building owners are going to be the folks most incentivized to digitize across all of their floors. That's going to be several years, down the road once they start to see different use cases, different ROIs for why this matters. But yeah, that's the case. In terms of your broader question, it's why it matters to collect building data now. I mean, it's important. Right now, as a business, we generate a derivative of a 3D scan, which is a building floor plan. But the reality is that the data that's trapped into these 3D models that we create is actually a lot more vast. For example, we can essentially quantify the floor area of one floor, of one room, of many floors, of an entire building, or we can get as granular as quantifying every part, piece, and component, from a door to a window to all the windows in a building to all the windows across a real estate portfolio. That matters because, that's the first step to kind of understanding what should be, is kind of taking inventory as to what you have. Today, that question, as silly as it sounds, can't easily be answered by even some of the most sophisticated landlords or multi-location operators. Their best alternative today typically sounds like they have maybe some sort of long folder of PDF plans that someone on their team is going to have to pull out and start taking manual quantity takeoffs, maybe spreadsheets that probably no one trusts because they were done 3 years ago, and that's a rough estimate as to what they have. And that's typically what you hear from even, some of the coolest, brightest, smartest companies in the world, is that they just can't readily answer what's exactly in my building. So to your point about why it matters long term, it's today, we're monetizing on creating a great scan to BIM made simple experience to just make sure that we can help bring buildings online as a first step. The next natural step is, okay, now that you've brought 2 or 3 or 10 or 20 of your buildings, now let's start to understand the parts, pieces, and components at scale, and how you could start using that data in ways that could be proactive and improve, your assets.